Tonight, you don't need to think. You don't need to try. Just rest. As you fall asleep, your mind becomes naturally open, calm, receptive, and focused. This story was designed to guide your subconscious toward clarity, confidence, and wealth while your body rests. There's nothing you need to do, just listen and sleep. The soft hum of the city faded beneath the weight of midnight, and in a modest apartment, Emma stared out at the distant glow of streetlights. Shadows stretched along her walls, silent witnesses to another day where dreams felt just out of reach. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and wondered, as she often did, where the boundary lay between wishing and receiving, between mere desire and that silent, unstoppable certainty that some people seem to possess. It wasn't about wanting more, she thought. It was about finding the place where yearning changed form, no longer a distant star, but an ember warming the very air she breathed. Emma's evenings echoed with quiet questions. Why did the solutions to her anxieties always hover at the edge of sleep, just out of focus? Why did inspiration feel so close when the world had slowed but drift away with morning's obligations? She had heard others speak of a bridge between conscious intention and the effortless certainty some called faith, others called vision, a private frequency, hidden in the ordinary, where hope could quietly become reality. Tonight, though, Emma sensed the faintest shift in her usual routine. She reached for a notepad, then stopped, realizing the urge for lists and forced resolutions always led to familiar disappointment. Instead, she slipped onto the couch, letting the worn cushions cradle her. Her mind, laden by the day's effort, softened its grip. This evening felt different, not because she resolved to make it so, but because something in the atmosphere suggested that possibility had many entrances, most of which appeared when the door to logic was only half open. As she lay still, her thoughts traveled to stories she'd heard in passing, tales of artists and inventors struck by insight, just as they floated between drowsiness and slumber. Whispers of thinkers whose fortunes had turned after nights of silent communion with their own mind's depths. She recalled how some described a certain serenity that settled before sleep, an openness, a gentle receptiveness, not a desperate grabbing at solutions, but a gentle listening. Emma remembered her grandfather, who rarely spoke of ambition, yet seemed to attract small bursts of luck, unexpected opportunities, effortless recoveries from setbacks, the right words at the right moments. Years ago, he'd once said over late-night tea, "It's not what you chase while awake that fills your cup overnight. Sometimes, it's what you quietly tune into as the world hushes." She hadn't understood then, but it lingered. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtain. Emma's breathing slowed, the night pressed closer. Sitting in that liminal space between day and dream, she wondered, could her mind, too, become something more than a restless archive of wishes? Was there a way to change the static of daily doubts into the clear signal others seemed to receive? She ran her fingers over a faded book found years before in a secondhand shop. The spine whispered of authors who believed that minds, like radios, could tune in and out of possibility. Emma had always dismissed such notions as hopeful metaphors, but tonight the idea seemed to hover at the edge of logic, tempting her curiosity. The apartment's silence offered permission to slow down, to listen as her own thoughts drifted in gentler currents. She thought of all the moments in her life when trying harder had yielded little, but surrender, those rare instances of ease, had illuminated a different path. The pattern felt almost invisible, as if the connection lived in the pauses between striving, in the unseen alignments of mood and mindset that occurred when defenses were low. As her eyelids grew heavy, Emma's mind was drawn not to what she had failed to accomplish, but to what might be possible if effort and expectation did not always need to wrestle for control. She didn't crave control tonight. She yearned for that elusive assurance, the conviction that just before dreams claimed their territory, something inside her might click into place. Beneath this quiet longing, a new idea flickered, delicate and daring. What if she allowed herself to become receptive, not by force or repetition, but by slowly letting go? Could rest itself be a doorway, the quiet interval when old patterns loosen their grip and something subtler has room to unfold? She drew a blanket up to her chin, the apartment dim except for a sliver of moonlight. Sleep approached, gradual and inevitable, inviting her to step inside a different space. She smiled, sensing the difference between resignation and readiness. Tonight, she wasn't chasing solutions. She was listening for a softer signal, one carried in the silence between thoughts, waiting to be received by those brave enough to tune in, just before the world faded and the self became, for a moment, utterly still. As daylight finally slipped away beyond the city skyline, a gentle hush settled around Emma. She stretched out on her old couch, tracing the worn seams with absent-minded fingers. Everything around her, from the hum of distant traffic to the soft creak as she adjusted her legs, became part of the subtle tapestry of evening. Her mind was neither fully alert nor entirely drifted, but gliding through a peculiar borderland, one that few people truly explored with curiosity. Unexpectedly, a memory surfaced, her friend Daniel's odd theory that every person lives inside a kind of mental mansion, each room painted by their experiences, beliefs, and unspoken dreams. According to him, most folks rarely ventured beyond the familiar corridors. Yet, extraordinary outcomes appeared in lives of those daring enough to wander deeper, especially when dusk tilted reality sideways. Emma had always laughed at Daniel's metaphors, but something in the air felt promising, making her consider whether her own mansion hid doors she'd left unopened. Furthermore, as she lay enveloped by scattered cushions and the muted amber glow of her reading lamp, she began to sense how expectations could be either invisible anchors or springboards. It was as if her imagination tiptoed through uncharted hallways, brushing up against forgotten ambitions and old fears stacked in dusty corners. The feeling wasn't unsettling. Rather, it suggested that untapped possibility could suddenly become accessible, almost by invitation. Emma wondered if everyone, inside their quiet moments, noticed such gentle invitations, or if most shut them out, lost in the static of practical concerns. Only then did she recall a late evening conversation overheard on a crowded bus. An older woman with a gravelly laugh explained to her companion how she always placed an empty cup beside her bed at night. In her words, "It's for whatever I might receive." While others might dismiss such a ritual, Emma found new meaning in it this evening. The woman seemed to trust that guidance or opportunity might appear, not by force, but through simple preparedness, almost like preparing a seat at a dinner party for an unexpected guest. Building on this reflection, Emma now noticed how her sensations shifted as she lingered in this half-lit space. Her limbs turned heavy and her thoughts became fluid, meandering through ideas without friction. The sense of self stretched gently wider than usual, like someone rolling out a soft rug for insight to settle upon. Faces and fragments of memory rose unbidden, her childhood backyard, the velvet hush of winter mornings, the scent of cinnamon from holiday kitchens. These impressions shimmered in and out, as though carrying subtle messages for her to decode. On another level, she realized people often underestimated the role of gentle observation during these transitions. While many rushed to capture fleeting ideas with pens or devices, Emma simply let each sensation visit and recede, trusting that the most vital would linger. Was it possible that greatness, for some, was less about relentless effort and more about letting themselves be found by insight? The question itself seemed to roll through her, prompting a tiny ripple of goosebumps. Now, consider how this phenomenon might shape a person's destiny in subtle increments. Emma's breathing synchronized with the quiet rhythm of the evening, her attention sharpening not through force but through soft receptivity. She sensed her pulse echoing a quiet invitation, as if each beat asked, "Are you ready to listen, really listen, to something deeper?" The notion brought unexpected comfort. She began to embrace the idea that every individual holds within them a sort of hidden frequency, one only accessible in these rare, gentle intervals. Consequently, Emma felt a quiet curiosity toward what other nightly rituals people had invented over centuries. Small gestures to welcome abundance, symbols to attract confidence, words whispered into darkness that might ripple out and bring change. She pictured a mosaic of unseen practices worldwide. Coins placed under pillows, secret boxes beneath beds, lullabies spun not just for children, but for the grown heart desperate for reassurance. As the lamp's glow shrank even further, she perceived the onset of a gentle calm. This tranquility was not passive, but alive, a subtle certainty pulsing just beneath the surface of her thoughts. She understood, in some freshly discovered way, that readiness for gifts and answers was more a matter of inner arrangement than outward striving. Emma let herself drift, neither hoping nor strategizing, but gently opening every room in her inner mansion, quietly awaiting whichever guide or idea might step through the silent hallway next. As the hours slipped deeper into night, Emma became aware of a subtle shift within herself, a barely perceptible realignment, as if invisible gears inside her recalibrated. Outside, rain began to patter steadily against the pane, each drop marking time. She listened, feeling an unspoken connection to each rhythm, a quiet code, perhaps, that only she was meant to perceive tonight. This wasn't just poetic musing. Something practical stirred in the background, like a craftsman returning to refine a long-forgotten instrument. Unable to resist this unfamiliar energy, she rose and made her way to the small kitchen, her fingertips gliding over the cool tile. Opening the fridge required no conscious intent. She simply reached inside, pouring a glass of water with newfound appreciation. The coldness against her skin offered a grounding detail, anchoring her in the present. She stood there silently, eyes wandering over forgotten magnets and the lined notepad with unticked items, and let the silence sharpen her awareness. These little cues, these unassuming acts, unexpectedly deepened her receptiveness, as if everyday objects chose tonight to reveal new purpose. Emma caught herself smiling, struck by a peculiar insight. Sometimes, endeavors that seem trivial hold the power for subtle recalibration. Take the story of Nina, a violinist who claimed her finest performances were born from simply tuning her strings in darkness, letting her sense of touch replace sight. She described these nocturnal rituals as a way to unite anticipation with certainty, fingers trusted to find the right tension without visual guidance. Now, Emma wondered if every person possessed such nocturnal rituals, personal ceremonies requiring nothing more than quiet acts carried out in the privacy of fading light. A breeze threaded its way under the kitchen door, carrying with it the scent of distant rain-soaked pavement. Emma closed her eyes and let herself be enveloped by the aroma, a sudden memory returning. Her cousin, at a low point in his business, would stand barefoot in the grass just before sleep, eyes closed, letting the earth's dampness assure him of renewal. His faith rested not in visual affirmations, but in a willingness to accept comfort through physical sensation, a reminder that feeling connected to the ground could plant ideas as surely as it did roots. Refocusing, Emma realized that every person must discover their own unique doorway into that receptive state. For some, it arrives in the gentle repetition of brushing their hair beside an open window. For others, it's the quiet click of a lamp switched off and the immediate hush that follows. Opportunities for realignment often appear wrapped in such ordinary moments. An unhurried cup of tea, the softness of fresh sheets, even the act of undressing at the end of a long day, letting tension fall away with each garment. Moreover, Emma pondered how anticipation could blend so intimately with ease. This wasn't about naive optimism or magical thinking. It was an act of openness, a deliberate allowance of uncertainty mixed with hope. She asked herself, what if tonight is the night something shifts permanently inside me? The question wasn't desperate, just quietly daring, a prompt to make peace with not knowing and still greet sleep with expectation. As time drifted by, Emma, glass of water in hand, padded quietly back to the living room. She set the glass down beside her, content to let it simply exist, waiting, just as she was, for whatever unseen adjustment might occur. In these last minutes before surrendering to sleep, an atmosphere of gentle expectancy filled the room, as though possibility brushed by to leave a single, silent note for her to discover with the coming dawn. Gradually, as the subtle echoes of rain softened into an almost hypnotic drizzle, Emma noticed a peculiar kind of silence blooming within her chest. This quietude wasn't emptiness but anticipation, the sort of expectant hush preceding something remarkable. She watched as city lights shimmered outside, casting intricate patterns across the ceiling. These transient mosaics seemed to pulse with hidden hints, offering possible routes into newly unfolding perspectives. She felt as though an invisible hand was arranging the scene, orchestrating a novel flavor to the air she breathed. In a rare impulse, Emma reached for a basket she'd seldom explored, nestled on the bottom shelf of an old bookcase. Inside rested trinkets and papers, souvenirs not of milestones, but of almost forgotten detours. She let her fingers dance over a faded train ticket and a seashell with its own silent spiral. One slip of paper bore a name from years past, a fleeting romance, a different self, prompting a minute-long reverie about paths not taken. Paradoxically, instead of regret, what sank into her was a softened curiosity about the countless possible realities hovering along her timeline. What would it feel like, she wondered, to act without expectation of outcome, to treat uncertainty as a companion rather than a foe? To disrupt her own patterns, she pressed a light switch and allowed the last lamp to flicker out, plunging the room into darkness softened by intermittent lightning. In this cavern of shadow, another sense awakened, a sharper awareness, not just of surroundings, but of possibilities that might swell in the space left by silence. She became attuned to new, half-formed ideas, as if inspiration itself needed dimness to surface. In that pitch-black mosaic, the faintest outline of an answer to an unspoken question became visible. Soon, a memory came unbidden. Years ago, during a sleepless night abroad, Emma had risen at dawn and watched local fishermen assemble their nets, speaking little, their entire choreography dictated by an ancient rhythm. None of them checked watches or barked orders. Each seemed to know instinctively what came next, every gesture flowing into the next with practiced faith. The memory sparked something inside her. Perhaps there existed an invisible language, a silent vocabulary learned not by study, but by surrendering to intuition when the outside clamor faded away. As she surrendered to this insight, Emma began to notice her breath deepening, shoulders releasing burdens she'd almost gotten used to carrying. Drawing in each gust of air, she recalled stories of explorers who credited their greatest discoveries not to methodical search, but to an openness that arrived only at the edge of fatigue. These travelers described pivotal moments, a sudden urge to turn down an unfamiliar path, to pause at a forgotten crossroads, choices that made all the difference. Emma recognized the golden thread tying these stories together wasn't effort, but willingness to let go of certainty for a short while. Without realizing it, she started to murmur low, tuneless sounds, a spontaneous melody that neither soothed nor agitated, but simply allowed her to remain present. She could almost hear an echo of long-ago lullabies, crafted not to induce sleep quickly, but to wrap the listener in reassurance. Here, drifting is allowed. Here, not knowing is safe. Such sounds seemed to blur the boundaries between the day's sharpening logic and the night's gentle dissolution of form. Emma's eyelids drooped. Yet, even on the brink of sleep, she lingered in this gentle state of expectancy. Rather than striving to seize or direct the future, she permitted herself to float alongside it, curious for what might emerge from darkness inflected with possibility. It was as if all the disparate moments of her life shimmered just beyond reach, poised to intersect and offer clarity, not because she demanded it, but because she had finally stilled herself enough to receive. Through that gentle surrender, Subtle harmonies began to flicker, hinting at the secrets found only when one listens with trust instead of tension. As darkness melted into the room, an unspoken sense of readiness flickered within Emma. Instead of searching for an elusive answer or chasing after inspiration, she began to notice subtler ripples throughout her awareness. A curious, almost magnetic current seemed to emanate from the everyday objects around her. A collection of greeting cards in a drawer, the resin ring she'd purchased years ago at a local market, the faint outline of a city map taped beneath her desk. These artifacts, collected along different seasons of her life, now pulsed with fresh possibility, as if their stories longed to reawaken. In that stillness, her attention shifted from the external noise to an internal horizon she rarely explored. Not drawn by nostalgia, but by a forward-leaning curiosity, she began wondering if such details could function as invitations. At that moment, her phone vibrated softly against the wooden table. The screen cast a pale glow, illuminating an old group chat blinking with several missed messages, each from someone who had once shared a late-night walk, a secret wish, a piece of encouragement. Instead of responding immediately, she traced their names with her eyes. Memory mingled with longing, yet this was no aimless drift. It ignited a new question. Did relationships, like intentions, send signals echoing through invisible chambers, quietly reshaping destinies while midnight's hush protected their momentum? Leaning back, Emma exhaled slowly. From another room, a faint melody drifted, a neighbor rehearsing piano scales with determined fingers. Each note floated in and out, never lingering long enough to be grasped, but together weaving a fragile tapestry of anticipation. She sensed something vital in the way these imperfect notes coalesced, gaining fullness through their collective resilience. It dawned on her that this process mirrored a secret mode of transition, where expectation, faith, and anticipation strolled hand in hand. This wasn't about results. It was about cultivating an atmosphere where possibility could take root and develop without pressure. Pausing, Emma reached for a thick woolen scarf draped across the arm of her couch. Spreading it over her knees, she reveled in the texture, rough in places, surprisingly soft in others. The sensation summoned a childhood recollection, a winter spent observing her mother weave yarn into intricate patterns for hours on end. Back then, she'd believed the product was everything. Now, years later, she recognized something more significant. The quiet, rhythmic act itself generated warmth, patience, and, eventually, belonging. The point wasn't to finish quickly, but to nurture an environment where organic growth became inevitable. Warmth gathered around her as she fixed her gaze on the horizon visible through the window. Subtle orange and purple streaks colored the edge of night, signaling a transformation neither swift nor showy. She considered how natural cycles refused to hurry, instead unfolding in time with their own secret tempos. This observation brought an unexpected surge of peace. She realized that approaching her desires with gentleness, rather than urgency, could create a far steadier foundation for the outcomes she hoped to see. With each passing moment, silence deepened. Yet in this expanding hush, Emma noticed the faint heartbeat of new beginnings. She imagined each hope, each deeply felt dream, as its own frequency tuning quietly in the background, awaiting recognition. Perhaps these signals only emerged when all other guidance surrendered to patient stillness. Now, reflect on how this gentle unfolding could shape the path of anyone tuning into their own silent wisdom. What memories might be waiting to rise, not as reminders of loss, but as blueprints for unfamiliar strengths? Which melodies, barely audible beneath daily routines, might blossom into harmonies of possibility if met with openness rather than resistance? If you sensed one small adjustment on the horizon, a subtle dial waiting for your touch, would you be ready to lean in, trust the silence, and let it play out its magic? Emma lingered, savoring the delicate promise of what comes to those who gently attend to their own frequency, long after the noise has faded. In the unhurried darkness, Emma's senses sharpened, making her aware of details that usually slipped past unnoticed. The furnace's intermittent sigh competed gently with a distant siren, while a delicate scent of lavender from an almost empty sachet wafted past her nose. Anxiety, which often found shadows to cling to at this hour, now found itself gently outnumbered by something much more intriguing. A sense that the familiar rules of decision-making had quietly melted away, replaced by an urge to explore not the surface of things, but their hidden roots. Elsewhere in the building, a door clicked shut. The sound, unexpectedly distinct, reminded her that while most drifted off without ever questioning the process behind it, others, those attuned to subtler cues, managed to shape the very texture of what dawn would deliver. Emma found herself considering a story she'd once heard about an old watchmaker who spent his nights dismantling not only the faces of clocks, but the very notion of time's authority. Each evening, he would sketch mechanical dreams before drifting off, believing that these blueprints would somehow be waiting in his mind's workshop come sunrise. His nightly surrender to inspiration seemed to suspend the usual linear march of hours, lending his inventions a kind of temporal freedom impossible under harsh daylight. Building on this realization, Emma wondered how routines, often dismissed as mundane, could morph into incubators for transformation when approached differently. Instead of following predictable patterns, some chose to invite unpredictability, to arrange books in an odd order, to sleep with an open journal nearby, to listen for the language embedded in rain or wind. By disrupting habits, they created fresh neural paths, much like hidden tributaries feeding the main current. This willingness to stray from the script, even just before slumber, sometimes yielded small shifts that nudged entire worlds in new directions. At that moment, a gust tapped the window pane, nudging Emma's gaze toward the horizon beyond the glass. Streets glimmered under the stray gleam of passing headlights. Somewhere out of sight, a cat negotiated with the night, pausing for invisible negotiations at the crossroads of instinct and caution. She pictured herself traversing a landscape mapped not by logic, but by affinity, a gentle stream pulling her along, inviting trust in connections that couldn't be charted in advance. She recalled how, in her childhood, sleep always arrived as an invitation to adventure. There were secret doors in wallpaper, mysterious islands under the safety of blankets, and conversations with fictional friends invented during lightning flashes. With age, those gateways became rare, barricaded by reason and routine. Yet, in this liminal stillness, Emma sensed the possibility of reclaiming that territory, not with effort, but by relinquishing the compulsion to direct each moment. Continuing in this vein, Emma's attention shifted toward the interplay of security and openness. She considered how architects sometimes built houses with windows set oddly askew, designed specifically to encourage fresh channels of air and light. Such homes thrived precisely because their builders refused to imitate the standard blueprint. In similar fashion, individuals could recreate the architecture of their inner experience. By introducing small surprises, an unheard melody, a new arrangement of familiar objects, a whispered hope, they could prime the mind for abundance and adaptability. Now, pondering what message this day's end might carry, Emma questioned whether those seemingly insignificant variations, leaving a book half-read, rearranging a photograph, or sipping water with deliberate attentiveness, could serve as keys. What subtle signals might tomorrow reflect back if this moment's openness became the new foundation? Outside, the world continued spinning. Yet, within the gentle ambiguity of late night, Emma detected movement, a silent alchemy reshaping expectations, exchanging old certainties for untapped potential. Suspended in that hush, she readied herself for whatever dawn's first light might illuminate, knowing the most lasting shifts often required no witness but the sleeper and the silent promise of possibility. Curled beneath a herringbone blanket, Emma listened to the gentle tick of a wall clock. Its steady rhythm seemed to measure something deeper than minutes, It attuned her senses to the currents swirling within her mind. She drifted away from familiar thought patterns, letting her gaze linger on the pattern of moonlight, fracturing across the parquet floor. Each silvery segment drew her attention to a realm of possibility not governed by habits or routines, but by an undercurrent she'd never consciously followed. Meanwhile, a subtle unease nibbled at her composure. What if this atmosphere held more than rest, holding clues she'd been too busy to interpret? Her eyes adjusted, picking out details usually dismissed. The asymmetric shadow cast by a pile of unread magazines, the almost imperceptible hum of a neighbor's radio bleeding softly through the plaster. In these minor disruptions, she sensed invitations to recalibrate, as if every out-of-place note carried hints of another reality struggling to be heard above the familiar static. Suddenly, Emma's phone buzzed and illuminated a snippet of news she would have scrolled past in daylight. The headline told of a botanist unraveling how certain seeds only awaken in absolute darkness. There, stripped of sunlight and expectation, genetic wisdom unfurled and coaxed new life from husks that had waited years. This made her wonder, did aspirations in a human mind require something similar, an intentional retreat, a peace where untapped ambition might uncurl unseen? Unlike the manic push so celebrated in working hours, here was a suggestion that dormancy itself could be transformative, but only if someone surrendered to it willingly. From this perspective, Emma's mind flicked through examples of personal reinvention she'd encountered. Daniel, her former colleague, came to mind. Fired from a job he once loved, he surprised everyone, not through relentless activity, but by entering a period of digital silence and deliberate withdrawal. Outsiders might have mistaken this stillness for stagnation, yet, when he re-emerged, Daniel had mapped out an entirely new direction, a creative agency born from months of latent artistry, revealed only when external activity ceased. Stories like his suggested progress doesn't always parade as relentless forward motion. Sometimes, it blooms quietly while no one's watching. Looking further afield, Emma remembered a documentary detailing migratory birds veering far from ancestral routes during unexpected storms. The scientists speaking on screen likened these detours not to aimless drifting, but to nature's improvisation, pivots so sophisticated that new ecosystems were sometimes built along these accidental journeys. The metaphor resonated deeply with her at that moment. Circumstances perceived as disorienting could, in retrospect, seed innovation or renewal, providing fresh maps for travelers willing to trust uncharted skies. Her thoughts circled back to the subtler forms of resilience cultivated during these in-between hours. She envisioned an interior landscape unraveled by adaptive habits, the slow unfurl of muscles into comfort, the peculiar creativity sparked by dim light, or flashes of insight stitched together in stillness. Rather than resisting, Emma wondered what new opportunities might arise if she welcomed uncertainty as part of the process, not an intrusion, but a catalyst for new patterns to emerge. Now, imagine standing on the threshold of such a moment. Consider how every person has periods of confusion or pause, intervals many instinctively rush to escape. What if, instead, these intervals worked as silent tutors, offering the time and ambiguity necessary for unconsidered possibilities to coalesce? By relinquishing the urge to orchestrate every moment, perhaps anyone could give permission for new pathways to be charted. Emma surrendered to the idea that comfort with sporadic, uncontrollable change might be the magnetic force drawing hidden potential into reach. The resonance of this notion sent a ripple through her, promising that sometimes, surrendering to uncertainty is the only doorway to growth no plan could foresee. A faint vibration from the floor startled Emma as she balanced, nearly weightless, on the edge of leisure and awareness. The vibration, almost imperceptible, came from a train rolling far beneath the city, silent to most, but tonight finding its way through the pipes and beams, echoing up into her bones. Something about this dull resonance, The faintest hint of movement beneath stability felt strangely reassuring. She sat up, intrigued by an urge to connect with the changes running below what could be seen. In that stillness, the sense of hidden machinery grinding gently onwards served as a metaphor. Vast systems, invisible yet ever-present, subtly guiding direction while most above ground remained oblivious. Fascinated now, she reached for a notebook left unopened for months. For reasons unclear, tonight its empty pages beckoned with possibility. Without conscious plan, she uncapped a pen and let it hover above the ivory expanse. New impulses urged her to sketch, not words but interconnected lines and shapes, spirals looping into other shapes, suggesting pathways and crossings with no obvious start or finish. As her hand moved, she realized these spontaneous marks sprang from an urge to externalize connections that had drifted unformed through her mind. The page became a playground for intuition untethered by logic or recollection. In some ways, the cipher she created served as a map of inclination, revealing intersections she'd never dared name aloud. Lost in this exercise, she remembered hearing about a ceramist who claimed inspiration didn't descend from above, but welled up through her fingers in quiet solitude. The most intricate clay pieces took shape when she permitted hands to move without expectation, surrendering the design to forces she never named. Emma realized that sometimes breakthroughs arise only when guided by momentum unrecognized by conscious thought, a tide that lifts and sets new intentions at the perfect hour. She began to sense that surrendering to these springs of creativity could reorient not just plans for the future, but the very way one perceived reality. A distant car horn, abrupt and solitary, jolted her focus, and her gaze wandered to the sharp contrast of lamplight pooling across the table. Shadows danced, elongating and shrinking, bringing to mind stories of inventors in isolated labs, piecing together innovations from intuition and flashes of insight. It seemed that illumination often required just enough discomfort or disruption to allow entrenched assumptions to fall away. How many solutions waited, masked by convention, simply because no one dared let uncertainty guide their hands for a moment. Turning the page, Emma's sketches grew more intricate, threading fresh possibilities through territories she hadn't believed were hers to explore. If someone from outside glanced at the paper, they might see only chaos. Yet she recognized signposts, sudden turns, abrupt stops, gentle arcs, each symbolizing untried options and new ways of interpreting chance events. She realized how often people defaulted to former patterns, missing the latent magic in acts of unpremeditated wandering. Now, consider the potential inherent in opening to these impulses. In moments when patterns dissolve and structure softens, opportunity for metamorphosis quietly unfolds. Yet, only those attuned to such gentle signals embrace them. What if, instead of clinging to certainty, one permitted each minute interruption, every tremor beneath routine, to act as a guide? For Emma, this brief encounter with the unfamiliar, the pen, the shapes, the distant vibrations, marked a pivot. She could almost taste the freedom in acknowledging that future decisions need not echo past blueprints. Sometimes, all it takes is a willingness to follow the unseen current, tracing its course with curiosity, not expectation, and letting whatever emerges shape a new reality. Reflecting on this journey so far, one can sense a subtle, almost imperceptible weaving together of thought and sensation, like a tapestry forming under the quiet guidance of invisible hands. For Emma, each moment has become both a thread and a needle, guiding unseen growth beneath the surface of nightfall's hush. Outside, a distant clock tower sounds, its chimes floating through open windows, drawing attention to the passage of time not as a relentless current, but as an unfolding garden of possibility. Emma no longer measures experience by what has been checked off, but by the richness of what lingers when activity ceases. Each pause, each silence, no longer signals emptiness but serves as fertile ground, a resting place where anticipation quietly collects, delicate as dew forming on leaves before dawn. There is a tenderness in this space, a recognition that those fleeting, often overlooked intervals are where quiet transformation prepares itself. Tonight, memory and aspiration intertwine, creating a swirl not unlike the lazy turning of windblown leaves across a quiet street. Connections that once felt improbable now hover within reach, drawn forward by curiosity's gentle tug. Shapes flicker in imagination, a door ajar, allowing the glow of somewhere forgotten to illuminate what lies just ahead. Corridors, not empty, but waiting, lined with silvery potential. Scent of fresh rain lingers at the windowsill, infusing each breath with a sense of newness, an unspoken invitation to move freely, unburdened by repetition or restraint. Emma's thoughts do not march in straight lines now. Instead, they meander like a river slipstream, catching nuances and glimmers of possibility as they arise. She notices the interplay between certainty and ambiguity, each sliding silently into place like pieces in an elaborate mosaic. It's as if the night itself participates in crafting a mosaic whose meaning reveals itself only when gazed at from a softer, more receptive vantage. Boundaries between effort and surrender become blurred, blending into something surprisingly gentle, a suspension of necessity in favor of a growing trust that what is needed will find its way during these unhurried hours. There is, in each hesitating pause, a sense of expectancy, like pages cracked open to a story not yet fully told. Subtly, the environment encourages a sensitivity to nuance and shifting light, making room for insights that rise without warning or force. Every soft shadow, each breath drawn in, asks for attention to what stirs beneath conscious striving. The silence amplifies these intimations, suggesting meaning in places it was never sought before. The air thickens with quiet promise. Curiosity becomes a companion, chaperoning her across an unseen boundary. There was no need for declarations or repetitive mantras, only the subtle reassurance that the sought-after transmitter within was always prepared to receive, particularly when given the freedom to settle, restore, and dream. Emma's journey traced not a circle, but a widening spiral, hope layered upon faith, intuition feeding expectation, until growth itself felt as natural as breathing. For anyone lingering in this story's gentle afterglow, the implication lingers. Perhaps every evening, every moment of letting go, is an invitation to align with deeper sources of abundance and inner steadiness. Maybe fulfillment arrives not by force, but by releasing defenses and listening for the signals that rise only when all else falls away. The invitation is perennial, waiting for those brave enough to turn inward before rest, allowing a new frequency to settle and, without effort, become the architecture upon which tomorrow quietly builds. And in that silent agreement, possibility ceases to be a stranger, transforming itself into a constant, steady presence, simply waiting, patiently, to be recognized.